Ainsi, l'hôpital, je l'ai vu. J'en suis sûre. L'hôpital existe à Hiroshima. Comment aurais-je pu éviter de le voir?
Hiroshima Mon Amour is a 1959 French New Wave film, written by Marguerite Duras and directed by Alain Renoir. It follows conversations between an unnamed French actress, played by Emmanuelle Riva, and an unnamed Japanese architect, played by Eiji Okada. They are having an affair, and they fall in love with each other just a day before she must leave back to her home in France. The film takes place in Hiroshima nearly 15 years after a nuclear weapon of mass destruction was dropped on the city. Hiroshima is a city that has suffered an indescribable amount of death, destruction, and trauma. And at the time, it was a beacon for the anti-nuclear peace movement, and a symbol of the trauma that the war left behind. In the post-nuclear world, Duras and Renoir attempt to give a voice to this imprint of destruction left upon the city, or as Hannah Holtzman puts it, to express a, quote, transnational solidarity for Japan, unquote, and dissect the very mediums in which we carry memory as a society. In other words, Hiroshima Mon Amour is an attempt to connect with the collective trauma of the atomic bombs from an outsider's perspective, and moreover provide commentary over the very nature of this kind of memorialization. Holtzman describes this effect of transnational solidarity in relation to how we have developed localized communal conceptions of memory depending on where we're from, and what our relation is to the trauma of the atomic bombs or of any atrocity. In this case, although France is not directly responsible for Hiroshima's destruction, it still remains a part of the subsequent collective grief that followed after. And the film tries to answer some of the problems that arise when one tries to connect with trauma that they themselves have not experienced personally, or have even been impacted as a collective group by it. How can someone who did not witness trauma firsthand remember it? And what does it mean to distill that memory into a narrative and share it with someone else? To answer this, Renoir uses a series of really interesting non-linear storytelling techniques. Darcy Gauthier refers to this as the ungovernable image, the fission or fragmentation between two images. Leah Anderst calls this plural narration, moments of dual or multi-vision seeing where narrative agency becomes uncertain, and the film then dramatizes the difficulty of capturing history and memory through narrative. For instance, in the first scene of the film, we see the two lovers' naked bodies in close embrace. It's an intimate scene that actually starts off with the sight of ash settling on their skin. We get the idea that this might be a scene of two survivors experiencing being stuck underneath rubble after the nuclear explosion. Eventually, the scene shifts, and the ash that covered the bodies before is now replaced with sweat. And it becomes clear that the scene is no longer a scene of suffering, but one of, well, sex. These two images don't really have any correlation between them in the narrative sense. We're not really sure why the first version of the two same bodies was in fact covered by ash. The only thing we can identify is that there is in fact a clear disconnect between the images that has unresolved implications. In her article, Hiroshima Mon Amour, Between Everything and Nothing, Gauthier writes, quote, "There are two images in one. The fission of this first image is characteristic of Hiroshima Mon Amour in general. It captures the stereoscopic nature of this story, which is never one story but always two. Ash or sweat, skin or ash, sweat or skin, Lu or L, Nevers or Hiroshima, and the inscrutability of text and touch, image and text, touch and image, the look of skin and the feel of skin, and also the gap between past and present. This first scene, through its fission of images, embodies the very material of memory. As Marcel Proust might have it, memory arising out of the oscillation of two images." This article is getting at the idea that trying to represent memory that is inaccessible is paradoxical in nature. If one tries to represent a repressed memory, maybe like the one of surviving an atomic bombing and being covered in the radioactive fallout from the bomb, is impossible. Of course, neither of the lovers were actually survivors of the bomb, but maybe this is a larger metaphor about how the lines between love and trauma in this movie are inextricably linked. And in the same way that these two images that aren't necessarily related but depict the same subjects, this movie uses the arc of an impossible romance to tell a completely different story about the way that we experience others' trauma through our own experiences, and how any medium is inherently going to intervene between us and the experience by creating this ambiguous image and deferring visual, cohesive information. We are sort of forced to arrive at this more abstract idea of vulnerability and intimacy, especially through something like a sex scene. The ash that covers them could be interpreted as perhaps their traumas and their personal experiences with grief. And this idea is also fragmented as a part of a greater system where they are, in fact, connecting with each other on a very deep level. And for the rest of the movie, we'll be conversing and patiently listening to each other as they try to understand each other's subtleties and trauma. The film has these moments of paradoxic dualities that don't really coincide with the logic of the movie throughout. For example, there is a very strong dynamic between the two lovers in the first 20 minutes of the movie, where the French actress describes how she has seen everything that there is to see about the bombings and about the trauma that they caused. She saw the hospital, she saw the museum 4 times, she saw the hair and the tapes and all of these other mediums of memory that have served to preserve the memory of the traumatic past. To this, the Japanese architect responds, "You saw nothing." His rejection of her experience of this trauma draws parallels between the way that the movie creates its own storyline. You can see the effect of this compression into understanding when the actress laments that her story was indeed one that could be understood. She recognizes that to tell is essentially a cheapening of the memory and of the event, and it somehow betrays vulnerability and personal intimacy that the memory holds. Gauthier explains that the Japanese man's claims that she has not seen anything is based on the fact that although the French woman has seen the memorial and the photographs and everything else, they are not her memory, and they are in fact, quote, the camera's gaze, which is memorializing but not memory. Matthew Boyd Goldie has an incredible article on the rhetoric of grief in the context of this film. In it, he examines several instances of Manuel Riva's character facing her own trauma and her anxiety over losing memory about her traumatic past. In sharing her memory, she becomes closer to coming to peace with her trauma and effectively forgetting that which forever changed her life. Even the Japanese man acknowledges her as the symbol of love's forgetfulness, and that their time together is about the horror of oblivion. Goldie writes that the larger implication of this reciprocal dialogue is that if she can forget a moment in the past that was so important for her, then it might be possible for people to forget Hiroshima. In other words, that translating this memory into a narrative effectively destroys it, as it is no longer of a re-experiencing of traumatic memory in the present, but rather a story in the past. Joanna di Mattia also confirms this in her article and writes that she feels that in telling her story, she has already forgotten the German man. The telling, the remembering, as essential as they are, feels like a betrayal. Daniel Just writes, since her trauma concerns the death of her lover and thus the disappearance of something irreplaceable, in her interior monologue she wonders whether she did not betray the past by turning it into the present. Telling, she suggests, transforms the past, which, regardless of its misery, has become part of her and her fidelity to her lover. Suddenly, she remembers her madness after her lover was killed and her refusal to overcome it. Already then, pain was a sign of faithfulness to the past. Renoir and Duras seem to be making a point about the paradox of sharing traumatic memories. It's often hard to find a balance between remembering and finding emotional peace. If we create narratives around the stories of trauma, we risk losing their significance. But at the same time, if we don't let them go, trauma will burden us and haunt us. And so we must learn to share trauma and remember it in a way that doesn't assign trauma to a specific narrative. In other words, we need to learn to see trauma through our own experiences and find a balance between remembering and being weighed down by it. In its commemoration, Hiroshima Mon Amour stands apart from the rest of the innumerable ways that memory has been adapted into historical records, museums, exhibitions, and other forms of narratives. The film is actively challenging what it means to be a medium of traumatic memory by creating a romantic narrative as a non-linear metaphor for how people carry and share trauma.